Hi, this is Dr. Setka. In this presentation, I'll give you some background on the term the American Dream. We'll discuss its evolution over time and how we're going to use it as a lens through which to encounter the stories, plays, and poems that we'll be reading in this class. But first, we begin with the central question. What is the American Dream? Is it the promise of success for those willing to work hard enough to achieve it? Is it the guarantee of personal freedoms? Is it the attainment and hoarding of vast amounts of wealth? Is it spinning an unfortunate sex tape into a reality TV empire premised on the ethos of conspicuous consumption? Or is it the guarantee of equal opportunity and the uplifting of the masses? Is it about the self or the many? Is it about ideas or material goods? Is it about conformity, or is it about difference? In this lecture, I'll be giving you a very broad overview of how the idea of the American Dream has evolved over time, from the settlement of America's first immigrants up to today. I'll be mentioning certain historical terms that you should already know, but if your high school history education was as lackluster as my own, you may need to take a few minutes to define these terms on your own. Although the term wasn't coined until 1931, the idea of the American Dream is as old as the settlement of our portion of the North American continent, first by the Pilgrims and shortly thereafter by the Puritans. As with all immigrants who have made their way to the shores of our nation, the burgeoning American colonies represented for these British settlers the promise of opportunity and liberty. Specifically, the dream that these settlers sought in the American colonies was one of religious freedom. The Pilgrims and later the Puritans fled England to avoid religious persecution. Their writings reveal that they believed that they were God's chosen people, the new Israelites, whom God protected on their way to the Promised Land, and that the New World itself was the result of God's providential design. However, while these early British settlers came to the shores of America in search of religious freedom, they were only interested in freedom to practice their own version of Christianity. They were not tolerant of other religions or Christian denominations, and they actively oppressed people of other faiths, particularly Quakers and Catholics. They also thought that Native Americans who didn't convert to Christianity were agents of the devil. So, although the Puritan settlers weren't quite as touchy-feely as common Thanksgiving illustrations might have us believe, they planted the seeds of the part of the American Dream that imagines our country as special and set apart from other nations. John Winthrop, an ancestor of both George Bush and John Kerry, was the four-time governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He changed the goal of the colony from a commercial venture to a Puritan society, explicitly connecting Protestant religious ideas about predestination with capitalism, creating what we know today as the Protestant ethic. In a sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity, Winthrop set forth the idea that America was special, an idea that morphed into what is called American exceptionalism, because of its unique relationship to God and other nations. And here we have a rather comical political cartoon illustrating American exceptionalism as an ideology. But with the rise of Enlightenment ideals in the 18th century, we see a gradual shift from a focus on Puritan values to a greater emphasis on religious tolerance, the power of education, the importance of opportunity, and the possibility of positive change. The Founding Fathers, who broke away from England, were inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and incorporated these beliefs into the founding documents of our government, namely the idea that every citizen is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Specifically, their American dream created the possibility of a society in which individuals could break free of class restrictions and pursue the lives they chose, regardless of the social or economic circumstances of their birth. Sidebar. These inalienable rights did not apply to non-voting citizens, namely men without property, women, or people of color. So again, the American dream was limited to a few. In the 19th century, as the American government strives to push westward to claim greater portions of our continent, we see the American dream evolve still further. This push to acquire greater swaths of territory of the original west of the original 13 colonies became known as Manifest Destiny. Advocates for Manifest Destiny believed that Americans were free, even bounded by fate, to conquer the North American continent and expand the realm of democratic republicanism and Christianity. Under the guise of religious, political, and economic motivations, Manifest Destiny allowed Americans to pursue the American dream and subdue the Wild West. This version of the American dream emphasized the importance of self-reliance, individualism, and competitiveness, and in many ways it anticipated the ideas of social Darwinism as articulated by Herbert Spencer, who essentially argued that Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest applied to the human species too. The environmental and humanitarian implications of Manifest Destiny were frequently overlooked or not considered, resulting in ideology that still today seeps into our behaviors and perceptions regarding domination and superiority. For example, the fact that the so-called Wild West was not empty land for the taking, but in fact land occupied by hundreds of Native American tribes who were repeatedly subjected to genocidal practices and herded onto reservations, was completely ignored at the time. I would argue that we still see the ramifications of this today with regard to the fact that Native American communities are largely ignored by mainstream media and culture. Also occurring alongside the push westward was the abolitionist movement, which sought to extend the core ideals of the American dream, namely freedom, to enslaved African Americans. Indeed, while many whites sympathetic to the abolitionist cause believed that African Americans had already achieved the American dream when they were emancipated, history has shown us, and as we will also see in our study of African American texts, that what defines the American dream for African American communities in the 19th and 20th century is much more complex than that momentous historical event. Closely connected to the logic of Manifest Destiny and social Darwinism is the notion of bootstrapping, or pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. This idea was popularized in the 1890s by writer Horatio Alger, who wrote novels about boys who worked hard and rose up the social ladder from poverty through their own ingenuity. The problem with this idea, though, is that bootstrapping rhetoric often blames the poor and downtrodden for their poverty without considering the myriad social, political, and economic factors that work to create cycles of poverty. In other words, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have any boots. As we get to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we reach two periods of time that are respectively referred to as the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. These two eras in the United States spanned the years from the end of Reconstruction through the 1920s. The Gilded Age was an age of movement. Populations changed, people moved, and trade increased. Migration to the American West, a dramatic increase in immigration to the United States from foreign shores, and the peak of European colonialism in Asia and Africa were aided by the proliferation of railroads, steamers, telegraphs, and the telephone. The Gilded Age was the era of the corporation, the heyday of the robber barons and captains of industry. For many, the American dream became connected in this period to the attainment of wealth and prestige. While the Gilded Age brought outstanding prosperity to some, it was also deeply tarnished beneath its gold veneer. The poor became poorer, the tenement slums grew, and new immigrants endured increasing economic and social hardships. Some of the most successful corporate endeavors became monopolies. Consumer prices rose, and corruption and industrial labor abuses increased. The Progressives, a political movement fueled by middle and working class people, sought to solve many of the social injustices of the Gilded Age. Where the Gilded Age was highly individualistic, progressive reformers thought that the government had a responsibility to promote socially beneficial programs and laws, advocating for reforms such as the vote for women, the end of child labor, and the 8-hour work week. But then we get to the 1920s, and we return to an American dream that is very much concerned with the conspicuous consumption of material goods, the flaunting of wealth, and, well, just having a really good time. So after World War I, American attitudes shifted in this way. Stock market speculation and the increasing availability of credit, known then as buying on margins, meant that Americans could buy more even if they couldn't fully afford it. The culture of consumption on exhibit in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which we will be reading in English 208, provides an excellent example. This culture was made possible by the growth of a leisure class in early 20th century America. As the novel demonstrates, the growth of a leisure class in early 20th century America subverted the foundations of the Protestant ethic, replacing the values of hard work and thrifty abstinence with a show of luxury and idleness. In other words, the sudden wealth that many Americans began to acquire caused leisure and idleness to replace traditional ethics like hard work as the components of the American dream. Now, this all comes crashing down with the advent of the Great Depression in 1929, when millions of Americans lost their jobs. This economic catastrophe necessitated yet another shift of the American dream. Following the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt came the implementation of a set of policies known as the New Deal, which established social welfare programs such as Social Security and Medicare, echoing the ideas of the Progressive era. So again, the American dream shifts back to becoming associated with the idea of social uplift and opportunity. In 1931, a historian named James Truslow Adams captured the spirit of this idea when he coined the term the American dream in his book, The Epic of America. Now keep this in mind. The term American dream actually did not exist before 1931. James Truslow Adams is credited with coining it. In The Epic of America, he speaks of America as a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with the opportunity for each according to ability or achievement, regardless of fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. The advent of World War II added further dimensions to this new iteration of the American dream. America's involvement in this global conflict cemented its role as a superpower, and thus the idea of the American dream, as part of the nation's cultural capital, became a rallying cry for soldiers and non-combatants alike. Indeed, many believed that participating in the war effort would spread the idea of the American dream all over the world. During the war, President Roosevelt defined the American dream as being comprised of 4 essential freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. People who could feed their families, keep them safe, worship as they pleased, and say what they believed were living the American dream. As you've probably guessed by now, things shifted after the war. Veterans used the newly enacted GI Bill to obtain low-interest mortgages on homes, resulting in a building boom and the creation of suburbs in the U.S. Thus, the American dream became closely tied to home ownership, and the American marketplace filled up with products to improve life at home, such as appliances, cars, television sets, and more. Televisions, in particular, became an important conduit for the reshaping of the American dream, as television shows projected images of the perfect American family and commercials encouraged viewers to spend, spend, spend. This emphasis on consumerism, combined with the increasing availability of credit, gradually transformed America into a debtor society. In the 1960s and 70s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, resistance to the war in Vietnam became more widespread, and college students began to push back against the consumerism of their parents, the American dream shifted yet again, emphasizing peace, freedom, and equality. On the heels of the ethnic empowerment struggles and the women's movement were born academic departments devoted specifically to the study of women and people of color. In fact, this class wouldn't exist if those movements had not occurred. Unfortunately, by the 1980s and the ideology of trickle-down economics, harkened back to the consumerist culture of the 1950s. And the gap between rich and poor steadily grew. By the 2000s, the decline of the middle class was no longer a question, but a certainty. And by the time of the 2008 election, research studies indicated that many young people believed that the American dream was dead. I've thrown a lot of information at you in this lecture, but if you've gleaned anything, it should be this. The American dream is not static. And thus it's possible that it may not actually be dead. It may just be in flux. It changes, typically shifting between an emphasis on self-reliance and personal ingenuity on the one hand, and a belief in the importance of universal freedoms and equal opportunity on the other. In this class, we will examine the ways in which ethnic authors respond to, revise, and reimagine the American dream. By reading an array of short stories, poems, essays, and plays by authors of different ethnic backgrounds, we will explore literary responses to the seeming paradox of the American dream. I hope you enjoy the course.